Hello, Raptors fans, and welcome to Raptors Report. Today we're going to be doing something a bit different than usual, which is that we're going to be adopting a bit of a podcast feel for this episode. And in fact, I've brought in an expert to discuss the draft with me today. The reason that I brought in someone to talk with me about the draft is because, while I feel I have a pretty good base of knowledge when it comes to the Raptors and the NBA in general, I'm not very well versed when it comes to college basketball, international basketball, or, draft prospects and that sort of thing. So rather than try and BS my way through a draft video, I've brought in a guy that I know from a message board called Real GM, someone who's very knowledgeable when it comes to NBA prospects, and his name is Sam. Welcome, Sam, to Raptors Report.
Thank you for having me on.
Is there anything that you kind of want to pitch? I know that you have a Twitter account. I can link that pretty quickly.
I'm on Twitter. I love to talk about basketball. If anybody listens to this and wants to talk to me about it, feel free to message me or give me a follow. That's kind of it.
All right, perfect. So let's get started. Now, the draft is in November. It's still a ways away, but I think that for a lot of Raptors fans, their sort of focus has turned to what next. And I think in the very short term, what's next is the draft. And so we have a bunch of scenarios that we're going to discuss today. And not to toot my own horn, but I think that the questions kind of cover all the bases, really, that could happen during the draft. Sure. So the first scenario, I think, is the most likely, which is that the Raptors don't make any moves. They decide to stand pat and pick at number 29. But, and I say but, because there are some unlikely scenarios that I think are interesting to discuss and I don't think are going to happen, but at the same time, you know what? Anything can happen in the NBA, especially with Masai Ujiri. So we are going to be discussing another scenario, which is that it's unlikely, but the Raptors trade their way into the top two. Because, Sam, as you know, the top two are up for grabs, apparently. The scuttlebutt around the league is that the top two picks, Minnesota and Golden State, Golden State was obviously looking to deal their pick. They probably want to get somebody who's a veteran who works better with Steph and Clay and Draymond.
They want to win now.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a much more concise way of putting it. Yeah. So they're looking to deal their pick, but I think one of the surprises, which really shouldn't be too much of a surprise, is Minnesota dealing their pick, because they made that deal for D'Angelo Russell, which I think I kind of liked it for them. They want to strike while the iron is hot, try and keep Cat in Minnesota, try and build a team around him. So they've made the number one pick available, apparently. So those two we'll discuss. We're not going to discuss maybe the names the Raptors would send out, but we'll discuss sort of what the Raptors would be looking for in return in one of those top two draft picks. And then the third scenario is a little more boring, but it's still worth discussing, which is that the Raptors might trade up a few spots, maybe if they see a guy that's fallen or somebody that they think is like really worth trading up for. Maybe Sam can fill us in on some of those players. All right, Sam, let's start with the number 29 pick, because it's the most likely to happen. So who do you have sort of some of the guys that you have squared away as people that the Raptors would be interested in?
Okay. Well, the first guy I would bring up is Zeke Naji.
Okay.
He's a freshman big from Arizona.
Right. And
so really the appeal of Naji is that he's this really fluid big man. He moves really well. He's 7 feet tall. He's not the longest guy. He's like a 7-foot wingspan. He moves really well. He's probably the most mobile big in the draft. So what you're looking at him is you're looking at some elite pick and roll defense.
Right.
Just potentially, he should be able to switch your ball screens, should be able to blitz, really attack a ball handler. And he's a good matchup if you're, if you're going against 5-out offenses, like say the Celtics, for example.
That is, I think, probably one of the most important aspects for a new age big man to have in the league, is that switchability, or the ability to at least mitigate the effectiveness of the pick and roll. Because the pick and roll is the way that you get we saw it in the Raptors-Celtics series, is that they use that ball screen to mitigate the Raptors' big men. Like Serge Ibaka, even he's pretty quick on his feet. He had trouble in the pick and roll. Obviously, Mark, he's a great defender, but in the pick and roll, you can really make it difficult for him. So having a guy with, quick feet, the height and the size to protect the basket, but also that, as you were saying, like a fluid range of motion and the ability to cover people on the perimeter, that sounds like a pretty important part of important skill to have in today's NBA.
Yeah, it is. And on top of that, he has the stuff that the Raptors we talked about before. Well, he's not old, but he's a good rebounder. He's got a really strong motor. There's great stuff about his work ethic. And he didn't show it in college, but I think he's going to be a good shooter.
Okay.
In college, he just took mid-range shots, but if you watch him shoot, he has a nice little stroke.
So, yeah, you can see he's a 76% free throw shooter, and usually that's kind of what people go by when they think about, does this guy have any stretch capabilities, is that free throw percentage. Another important thing to consider is that that's sort of a need for the Raptors, right? They have their two centers coming off of the books this coming off season.
For sure. I think if you have a player like Pascal Siakam, who really likes to work inside, you need to pair him with a stretch big, just to keep the spacing good. And so Naji, I think he'll definitely be able to do that. I think the Raptors probably think that too, because based on reports, he's been interviewed at least twice by them. So that's why I brought him up, because he's the guy with the most buzz from the Raptors so far. It's not much, because the Raptors are notoriously don't really leak much, but this is the guy we've heard the most coming out of their camp.
The interviews, I think, it doesn't say everything, but if the Raptors are talking to him, he has to be on their board somewhere, I think.
Yeah.
So what would you say kind of the Raptors are looking at if they were to select Zeke? Just kind of an overview of what his game is like.
I think you're looking at a really mobile bigs. He's not because he's not that long, you're not going to get many blocks from him.
Okay.
But he is good positionally. So he'll get between the ball and the rim, which is really what you want your big to do. And he'll be able to play pretty good pick and roll defense. So maybe you're looking at Cody Zeller from the Hornets. That's not really
it's
a guy
not sexy.
People have watched. Yeah.
It's not sexy, but he is a rotation player. And if you're drafting 29th, I mean, you can do worse than that. Okay.
Yeah, for sure. And Zeller can't really shoot. So if Naji adds that to his game, then that's a little level up.
So that's interesting. I like that comp. Maybe Cody Zeller who can shoot. I think if Cody Zeller could shoot, you'd be looking at like a guy that most teams would be interested in, maybe even sort of a starter on a playoff team. So, okay, that's interesting. Is there anybody else that you think maybe the Raptors could be interested in at that 29th pick?
Another guy to keep an eye on is Isaiah Joe. So he is a wing from Arkansas. So you're looking at a 6'5", 180 pounds, 6'10". He's very thin right now, which is probably his biggest drawback. But the guy is an electric shot maker. You're looking at one of the best shooters in college basketball. He can get red hot and he starts hitting crazy shots from all sorts of ranges. He doesn't need much space, and he can create for himself a little bit too. He was one of the best ISO scorers in his conference. He's got a nice little crossover and some step backs.
Okay, so it's important when you're looking at maybe later draft picks to identify a transferable skill. And what you're saying about his 3-point percentage wasn't incredible this season. It was, I think, 34%. But you're saying that his projected NBA range is probably a bit more impressive than that?
His stats don't show how good of a shooter he is. He kind of fell off between the year before and this year because of injuries.
I see.
But he is really one of the better shooters in this draft.
And that's kind of something that the Raptors prioritize. I've mentioned it in earlier videos about the Raptors, is that the Raptors are really looking for guys who can play defense and shoot the ball. Yep. And so if there's a guy that has that relevant NBA skill of being able to be a knockdown three-point shooter, you have to kind of take a look at that player and really evaluate based on that. So how is his defense? Is there a question mark there, or is it something that he's known for?
He is a good defender, I'd say. He's got nice quick feet. He's got good hands. He can poke the ball away. Mm-hmm. He's pretty smart off ball. He'll make the right moves. But again, he's really skinny right now. Mm-hmm. So I think he'll be able to defend multiple positions down the road. But for his first year or two, you're looking at he's going to be weak, and it'll be easy for NBA players to score against him.
Right. So this might be a, put him in the Raptors 905 for a bit of seasoning, get some reps down there, maybe get the team to help him work on his body for a season, and then, start sprinkling him into lineups toward the end of the season, that kind of deal. Is that what you're thinking?
Mostly, yeah, that's what you're looking at, because I think he's very playable offensively for an NBA team, but defensively, unless you can hide him on someone, it'd be pretty tough, especially if we're looking at playoff minutes.
Right, so when you're talking the Raptors and guys who have difficulty playing defense but can really shoot the ball, the guy that immediately springs to mind is Matt Thomas, who the Raptors used the zone defense in order to hide him on defense. I know that Nick Nurse likes to use the zone. He likes to go to the zone, but I think that one of the issues that he had with Matt Thomas was the fact that he kind of had to run the zone defense in order for Matt Thomas to be on the floor. But as we saw toward the end and into the playoffs even, they started to become a bit more comfortable with him in man defense situations, as long as he wasn't being matched up against a guy who's going to really punish him off of the dribble. So if that's something that they could do with Isaiah, sprinkle him into lineups and run that zone to get him comfortable playing on the floor with the main squad, that could be pretty interesting. Okay, Sam, now that you've given us two names that maybe we can expect to hear when the 29th pick rolls around in November, why don't we get to something a little bit more exciting and a little crazier, because I don't think it's going to happen, but who knows, it might. Let's talk about the top two picks, because those are apparently in play. The Raptors, as you know, are not afraid of making moves. Let's discuss the top two picks. If the Raptors were to make a trade for the top two picks, why don't you give me a breakdown on what we're looking at here?
So, if the Raptors were to trade for the top two picks, I don't know if I would heavily bet against that happening, just because I don't think it's a good idea.
Right.
But if they did, this is one of the weaker draft classes in a while. You're looking at perhaps the weakest one at the top since 2013, maybe.
Wow.
That's when, So this is a bad year to have a top two pick, which is why they're available. If it was a good year, they wouldn't be available, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you had that slam dunk franchise-changing talent.
Yeah. If you have Anthony Davis or a LeBron James at the top, then that pick's not getting traded.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we could talk about who would be leaving the Raptors, but I think that would be, just a guessing game, because each of these, there's three guys, they all have different skill sets, and I'm sorry to sort of spoil it, but I think that would you say that this is a three-person draft at the top here?
No, I don't think I would say that, just because I have a very low degree of confidence in the top three.
I see.
So if you told me 5 years from now that the best player in this draft was drafted in the teens, I'd believe you. I don't think there's a strong degree of separation between the top 3 and maybe somebody drafted at like 12.
Really? Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So you're looking at, they're at the top for a reason because they all have at least tantalizing star level upsides, but all of them have really significant issues as prospects.
Mm-hmm.
And if you bring in boom or bust, they're not going to bust hard, but it's very likely that a lot of them aren't significant NBA players down the line.
So maybe we're looking at the top here, a solid starter,
Yeah, you're looking at solid starters, probably, maybe. A worst case scenario, you have like a bench player, but there's no slam dunk star in this draft.
But would you say, are there any Hasheem Thabeets? Are there any guys that are just going to completely wash out of the NBA? Or is it they're sort of low ceiling, high floor type guys?
I wouldn't say there's a Hasheem Thabeet. Yeah, I don't think you'd see that, but I don't know if you're looking at like a slam dunk star here.
So who would you say is your number 1 overall? If the Raptors managed to grab the number 1 pick, who are they taking there?
I think it's tough to point out the best prospect in this draft, but in the event that the Raptors have the number 1 pick, I think the best choice for them would be Anthony Edwards.
Okay, so the guy that's at the top of most of the mock drafts. Yeah. What about him is interesting?
Well, you look at Anthony Edwards, and if you look at him through a highlight reel, he's got it all. He's 6'5", 225 pounds of explosive athlete. He can score in any way you want. He's got that pull-up, fade away, crossover, step backs. He's got anything in the bag, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the idea of Edwards. The actuality of him is not as nice.
You go through some of his statistics, and his three-point shooting isn't very good. His field goal percentage is pretty low. Maybe he doesn't have his defense figured out. His overall efficiency is kind of low for a guy who's as athletic as he is.
Exactly. Yeah, he's capable of making tough shots. Like sometimes he'll get hot and he'll be unstoppable. But he has maybe a Wiggins syndrome where he loves his ability to make tough shots too much.
Mm-hmm.
For a guy as big as him, he's not really that physical. He won't drive to the rim much. He'll settle and just pull up from mid-range every time. You'll see that for being the reason that he's such a mediocre efficiency despite playing in the NCAA.
Yeah, because his age is pretty good. He's a young guy, so he might not have it completely figured out. And that probably would be in a lot of front offices' minds, is that, yeah, he's not very efficient, but, you know, if we bring him to our team and we get him in our program, we're going to teach him how to do all the things he needs to do in order to make his potential, you know, realize his potential. But, you know, there's been so many guys that teams have thought that. You obviously mentioned Wiggins, but a guy that was on the Raptors a while ago, Rudy Gay, that was kind of the book on him, too. I was thinking
Terrence Ross.
Terrence Ross, yeah, absolutely. Although he was always like a fantastic shooter, and it doesn't appear that Edwards is that kind of guy.
I think Edwards will be a good shooter at least. Like, maybe not elite, but I think 29% it's selling a little low on what he actually is.
Right. You see the mechanics are probably a bit better than what his percentages are saying.
The mechanics are pretty clean, and we brought up shot selection earlier, and that's a big reason why his percentages are so low.
Okay, interesting. So that's Anthony Edwards. That's kind of like a 10,000 foot view of him. Who are the other guys at the top of the draft? Maybe guys that you would want to stay away from. Like, is there anybody in the top 5, top 3 that you're saying, like, absolutely no way should this guy be on the Raptors next season?
Well, I'd have a hard time arguing with whatever Masai does, but the idea of Wiseman is kind of concerning to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because you look at him and he's like a real big man. Like, he's real big man.
Nice.
He's 7 feet tall. He's got a huge wingspan. He's a good athlete, but he's not as athletic as you'd like. He's not super explosive. He's not as quick as you'd like. Mm-hmm. But the big problem with him, I think, is that his sense of who he is as a player and who he should be is pretty disconnected.
He's dominating the guys at his level. He might think he's like a superstar when in fact maybe he's better suited as kind of a role player.
It's not even that. It's the kind of star that he thinks he is. He thinks of himself as a unicorn.
Right.
So he literally described himself as a mix between KD and Giannis about a year ago.
Wow.
But that's not who he is, because he hasn't really proven that he can be that type of player. Even in the high school circuits, if you look at the EYBL, he took those kind of shots. He took shots that like only a Kevin Durant would take, but he didn't make them.
Mm-hmm. On the opposite side of Edwards, he was statistically dominant in college basketball. So do you think that that's just a product of him being so much bigger and stronger than everybody else at his level?
I think it's hard to take away too much from his stint in the NCAA. He only played 3 games.
Right.
So, and of the 3, he only played 1 against like a legit team with bigs, and he kind of struggled that game. And then after that, he had a personal falling out with the NCAA, and we haven't seen him since, really. It's interesting because by the time the draft comes, it'll have been at least 12 months since he's been on like a professional court.
Right. So here's what we're talking like really productive in limited sample size, obviously. Not the most athletic guy, like a true big man with big man skills. Like start picturing kind of in mind maybe like an Andre Drummond. Would that be a good comparison?
Yeah, I think Andre Drummond is a good comparison. Drummond has the same I'm a guard and a big man syndrome. I think if you pull him up right now, you'll see videos of him like doing crossovers and trying to take people off the dribble in summer. And it's like Wiseman has kind of the same thing.
So he's obviously still pretty young, and there's potential there, but you're seeing some red flags that would otherwise, in maybe a stronger draft year, send him maybe into the teens or into the lower half of the lottery. Would that be a fair assessment to make? Yeah,
I don't want to dog him too much because he does seem like a good person, but like I think the problem with him is just selling him on playing a role versus just being this superstar, because I don't think that's who he is. If he buys in on being like a Rudy Gobert type player, I think he can be a really impactful NBA player. But if he thinks that he's the next KD, then I think you're going to have issues, especially with organizations like the Hornets, which is probably where he's going to end up.
Right.
Where it'll be hard for them to rein him in versus a team like, maybe if he ended up on the Raptors, I think they could do a better job of kind of putting him on the right path.
I think that's a pretty good analysis of Wiseman as a prospect. So let's move on to the last guy. And obviously the number 3 guy on the list to talk about, Lonzo Ball's brother and son of LeVar Ball, LaMelo Ball. Can you maybe talk a little bit about him?
LaMelo Ball is pretty interesting because he's a huge point guard. He's about 6'6", 6'7", maybe. Got a nice wingspan. And he really is an elite passer. If you want to point out one elite skill in this draft, it would be LaMelo Ball's passing. He can make any pass in the book, both hands, full court, half court, he'll do it all. Mm-hmm. But the problem with him is that the entire rest of his game is questionable.
Right.
So you're looking at a player who struggled to shoot from 3. He struggled to finish at the rim. He doesn't really have a mid-range game. He does have a nice little floater. He had some issues with shot selection. He didn't play very much defense. So it's hard to bet on a guy like that, because even if you do have the passing, without putting together like a scoring package that defenders can really respect, you're not going to punish teams with your passing. I think you can look at a guy like Ben Simmons in the playoffs, where I think he's a much better player than LaMelo is going to be, but he's runs into the same issues where teams aren't respecting his scoring. And so you can't really do much facilitating if your scoring isn't respected.
Right. They play off of you. They pack the paint. They play the passing lanes instead of, trying to cover your shot. Absolutely. In my estimation, uneducated as it may be, he seems like he has a very high upside. If somehow you were able to make his three-point shooting more consistent, if you could get it into the high 30s range, then maybe you're talking about a guy who you could perhaps even build an offense around, just because his passing game is so developed. And if he were a threat from long range, you're starting to look at a guy who could run an offense at the NBA level. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think if you can get LaMelo to become like a good, like respectable scorer, then you can really build an offense around him. Maybe a good comparison would be maybe D'Angelo Russell. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Like a bigger version of D'Angelo Russell, who also had trouble scoring at the rim.
He became a very good shooter to compensate. Yeah, maybe LaMelo becomes a good finisher eventually. Like, we look at his family and you could see that they haven't had any issues putting on weight. Like, you look at Lonzo, he's gotten pretty big since he was drafted. And he's become a better finisher over the years. So maybe you can project that onto LaMelo.
Right, and I mean, the worst case scenario, well, I shouldn't say worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is he could be out of the league, but Lonzo Ball, he's not a bust. I mean, he's a serviceable player, and if he raises his percentages, you could be very happy with him as your starting point guard. So I don't think that's necessarily a horrible fate for LaMelo Ball if he were to turn into his brother. But obviously, with the top 3 picks in the draft, you're kind of looking for something a bit better than that. So that about covers the top 2. Why don't we fast forward? We will go to the last sort of part of this, which is that if the Toronto Raptors see a guy a little higher on a board, maybe he's fallen a little bit, maybe they think they can't get him at their pick, is there anybody that you think is worth trading up for, is it sort of tantalizing, that you see maybe going in the high teens, low 20s, that you think the Raptors could try and grab?
Oh yeah, for sure. If you follow me on Twitter at all, you'll see me really advocate for this guy, and that is Theo Maledon.
Okay. So
he is a French point guard playing in the EuroLeague for Asvel, so that's Tony Parker's club. So we've seen Masai. Masai has been spotted scouting him before COVID. So when he goes on these international tours every year. And I think he really is a perfect fit for what the Raptors need, either right now and for going forward. So you're looking at a combo guard. He's about 6'5", 6'9" wingspan. He's pretty similar physically to DeLon Wright, that is.
Right, of course.
People don't remember, yeah. So you're looking at a guy physically pretty similar to DeLon Wright. So he can play on ball or off the ball. He's one of the best pick and roll guards in this draft. So in terms of playmaking or scoring out the pick and roll, he's a great finisher for a guard. And I think that's something that the Raptors really need, is a guy you can get to the paint and finish. Because between Fred VanVleet, who's a pretty poor finisher, and OG, who doesn't really have an attacking game.
The moves to get to the basket.
So in terms of long-term core, there's not really anybody who puts pressure on the rim. I think Theo can be that guy, but he can also play right now next to Fred, next to Lowry, next to Siakam. He's a good shooter. He's potentially an elite shooter. That doesn't show in his percentages this year, but he's a guy who's played in the highest levels of Europe. He shot well coming from all sorts of situations, so you'll see a little bit of a pull-up game with him. You'll see him come off screens. You'll see catch and shoot. His handle is pretty, it's good, but it's not great yet, so it needs to be ironed out. And he had a down year statistically in the EuroLeague this year. He had a shoulder injury, and then his role changed halfway through, so you're going to see him falling a little bit on the boards. But he's very similar to, I'd say, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And I think that's a guy the Raptors really like. They tried to trade up for him before. And he's got all the traits that people like about Shai. He's big. He's got size and length. He's not as big as Shai. He's a little smaller, but he's got size. He's got vision. He's very crafty. He can shoot. Probably a better shooter than Shai is. And so short term, you're looking at a guy who could replace McCaw, for example, off the bench. You look at a guy who can hit shots, who can create for others a little bit, and who fits in the defensive scheme. So you could see him switch probably like 1 to 3 in the NBA. He needs to get a little more consistent defensively. But I think he'll be a positive defender. And so that's the guy I think is the best fit for the Raptors.
All of the things that you mentioned are very intriguing to me. Obviously, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Raptors were really interested in him. And I mean, it just goes to show that if the Raptors are interested in a guy, it turns out that very good instincts. They'll be good. And Sam, is there anybody, this is the last question here, is there anybody who's not on the big board, maybe some guy that might be undrafted, because the Raptors obviously have had a lot of success finding guys that have been undrafted. Is there anybody there that you think the Raptors should take a look at?
For sure. You can look at, there's a player coming out of high school. His name is Josh Hall. So he's a very similar player to Jaden McDaniels. So he's like a big forward. He's got a little bit of a handle, a jumper. He's got a little bit of the same concerns in terms of decision-making and shot selection. But he's got a reputation for being a hard worker. He's added weight recently. So you might see him in the second round, or you might see him undrafted. And I think the Raptors have talked to him. His dad said that in an article, I think earlier this week, that the Raptors were speaking to them. So that's a guy you could see them pull out maybe in the second round, maybe undrafted, as this kind of mysterious high school player with size and some ability.
Well, I'm definitely intrigued. That sounds pretty interesting. If you can get those high ceiling guys without having to spend a pick on them, you don't have to give them any guaranteed money. You can put them on the Raptors 905 and then develop them. If they are good enough, you give them that two-way deal. You get these really good value signings, especially if you're looking sort of for next offseason, the big offseason. You don't want to be spending a ton of money on role players. If you can develop them internally, not spend them those big bucks, maybe fill out your rotation, that's kind of something that you'd be interested in. So,
for sure.
Anyway, Sam, I want to thank you very much for giving your expert opinion on these kinds of things. Again, I'm going to put your Twitter handle on the screen here so everybody can go and visit your page. And I'm really excited for this draft. I'm really excited. Pretty much every draft that the Raptors have a draft pick. So I hope that this
been a while, huh?
Absolutely, I know. With the Raptors' reputation and the Raptors' ability to sort of find guys out of nowhere, I think that every Raptors fan, even with the 29th pick, should be really excited heading into this. And I think that about wraps up this episode. First of all, I want to thank my guest, Sam, for giving his expert analysis. It was a pleasure having you on, and I think everyone is now a bit wiser when it comes to the NBA draft. And hopefully we can hear from you again in a future episode.
Thank you for having me on. I'd be happy to come back on anytime.
All right. Cheers, Sam. Thank you to everyone who made it this far. Shout out to the people who are watching this at 1.25 speed. I don't blame you, this was a long episode, but I think it was definitely worth it. We got a great look at the NBA draft from a Raptors perspective. So remember to follow me on Twitter at Raptors Report, and remember to subscribe for more in-depth Raptors content.